morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for day 3 of our Media Development Snapshot speaker series. This is our 4th session with Dr. Janine Warner. She is the co-founder and executive director of Sembra Media. She also has a Knight Fellowship from the International Center for Journalists that support her work in Latin America. She is going to be speaking to us today on creating money-making content in media. Over the last decade, Janine has worked with thousands of journalists and digital media entrepreneurs in the United States, Latin America, and Europe. She has traveled extensively to deliver keynotes and lead seminars at conferences, events, and universities. In 2015, Janine co-founded Sembra Media with Mijal Lastrebner, sorry, I'm going to ruin this name, Yastrebner of Argentina.
I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you because nobody gets it right. Mijal Yastrebner.
Yastrebner. Okay, Mijal Yastrebner of Argentina. The nonprofit organization is dedicated to increasing the diversity of voices and quality content in Spanish by helping digital media entrepreneurs become more sustainable. Sembra Media provides business and technical training, market intelligence, networking opportunities, consulting, and financial support. The diverse team represents a regional network of more than 800 digital publishers in 20 countries in Latin America, the United States, and Europe. Janine has taught online journalism at the University of Miami and USC and has been a guest lecturer at more than 30 universities in the United States, Latin America, and Europe. She also taught a series of online courses, massive open online courses, also known as MOOCs, in entrepreneurial journalism for the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas at UT. Janine began her career as a journalist in Northern California and founded a bilingual newspaper in the early 90s. In the late 1990s, she worked for the Miami Herald as the online managing editor and later as the director of new media. She also served as the director of Latin American operations for CNET Networks. She's written or co-authored 25 books about the internet, including Websites for Dummies and Global Mobile. She has also created more than 200 hours of training videos for leading online learning companies, including lynda.com, Creative Live, and Kelby One. Janine has been a judge in the Interactive Emmy Awards, Pointers Fact Forward, the Knight News Challenge, the Arroba de Oro, and the World Summit Awards. She's a native English speaker, fluent in Spanish, conversational in Portuguese, and she plays nicely with translators. We are really grateful to have Janine here with us today because one of her passions is to help independent journalists remain independent, to get the story out there, but also take care of their people. She is a Knight Fellow, and I'm really grateful for all of the wonderful work she does to promote media freedom and independence around the world. So over to you, Janine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to join the journalism students, freelancers, business people, whoever's on this call. My goal is to try and share some of the research and work and things that we've learned working with media. I've been an entrepreneur myself, and I've studied media entrepreneurs, journalists who start media organizations, and other people building information-based organizations for many, many years now. So today I hope to spend just about an hour with you, giving you some of the highlights of my work. And with your permission, I'll share my screen and get started. Okay, so just to make sure everybody can see my first slide, lessons from digital media entrepreneurs. We good? Great. So one of the first things that led me to this work was realizing that it's easier than ever to start a news organization, right? Just about anybody can start a blog today or a podcast. And that's really different. When I first started in journalism, most media was either printed or on television or radio. It was very expensive to start a news organization. You need $1 million printing press or a broadcast license that often cost even more than that. But today with companies like WordPress, which is more than 75% of all the websites on the internet today are created with WordPress, from really simple ones to fairly complex ones like the one we have at sembramedia.org. Today, anybody can create a news media digital publishing organization. The challenge that we found is building a sustainable media business around that information. So we found lots of journalists who go out and start blogs, start newsletters, start media organizations. But when it comes to transforming them into a long-term publishing organization that can pay its employees and its team, that's where we find that it starts to get challenging. And so what we find is lots of journalists start out with this vision of the future that looks like, I'm going to be my own publisher. And the reality sets in and things are not quite as simple as they expected. And that's really why we created Sembra Media. We recognized that there were more and more journalists, particularly in Latin America, but increasingly we're seeing this all over the world, that are, for any number of reasons, starting their own media organizations. And to help understand all the different reasons and all the different ways that they're doing that, we've spent years assembling a team of journalists and researchers and professors and academics and investors and funders and consultants who work with these kinds of entrepreneurs all over the region. And so we have a basic operations team, mostly based in Argentina. I'm actually in the United States. But then we have a team of what we call ambassadors, much like the embassy does. Our embajadores, as we call them in Spanish, represent the media in each of their countries. And they've been studying and mapping the media in those countries and then creating an interactive directory where we can research them and share what we found. And one of our main rules at Sombra Media is we never do anything without studying it first. So a lot of what we produce, and apologies to those who don't speak Spanish, most of what we publish is in Spanish, because there's not as much information in Spanish about journalism entrepreneurship as there is in English. So we put out case studies about media in Latin America to help other media in Latin America learn from them. And we have events where we bring journalists and entrepreneurs and investors from the region together. We've even developed courses and training and workshops and seminars that we do. But at the heart of everything we do is that we study what the media leaders in the region are doing so that we can see what works. What are the best practices? What are the ways they're most making money? Where are the biggest challenges they run into? How do the ones that really become successful and have true impact and reach millions of people or reach really important niches, how do they do it? And so we created this directory, which today has about 867 media in it from 22 different countries. You can see fuentes de ingresos means different income sources. So you can start to see that many of them are supported by advertising, but there are also many other ways they make money, which I'll talk more about. And each of the media that we've researched, and that number fluctuates in the directory because it's been building. This slide shows that there's a little profile on each of the individual media. And so you can search for media in Mexico that cover the environment and use crowdfunding as one of the ways they get support. And you can find just those media, or you can find all the media that are digital media native. That's what we study and focus on. And we have a number of criteria actually for being in this directory. This is not every website and blog in the world. And it's not websites or digital parts of traditional media like television, radio, or newspapers. And that's not because we have anything against them. I worked as a consultant with many newspapers around Latin America before I started focusing on these entrepreneurs. But at Sembra Media, we only look at what we call startup media, even though some of these are about 20 years old, because they've been doing this for a while. They're not legacy media. They're not traditional media. They're digital native startups born on the internet and usually trying to cover news in a different way. And what we're finding is they're also run by different people. So one of the surprising things that we learned from our study was how many of them are run by women. To put this in perspective, in Latin America, most of the traditional media are run by men. In fact, there's a study in Mexico that shows that less than 1% of the television and newspapers in Mexico have any owners who aren't men. So to find out that in the directory today, 45% of the media that we study have at least one woman founder who helped start the organization and is leading the organization was really a striking finding. And they're all over the region, from Mexico to Argentina to Venezuela to Cuba. And we also look below that, you see con fines de lucro y sin fines de lucro, which means with they're either for profit or they're non-profit. So sin fines de lucro, without profit, is how you say that in Spanish. 32% of the media that we've studied are nonprofit and the rest are for profit. But they all meet some other very important criteria. They all produce original content in Spanish, because we believe that there should be more content in that language to balance some of the things going on the internet in terms of access to information. They all provide some kind of community service. They do it with enough transparency that they at least admit who the founders of the organization are and who's behind it. We think it's very important. To be an independent media, you also have to be transparent and show where your funding comes from, who's behind you, who the leaders of your organization are. So we study those things, and then we've created this directory out of media who are willing to share that and willing to meet our requirements. And the final big requirement for us is they cannot get all of their funding from a government, a political party, a corporation, or a single wealthy individual who's just using this news organization for propaganda or personal promotion. So we're looking for news organizations that serve a community with transparency and independence, and learning from them over the last now more than 6 years has really informed everything else I'm about to tell you. So I'll tell you, using Zoom like this is not new for me. I've actually been doing Zoom calls like this one for more than 5 years, because Sembra Media started as a virtual organization. This is something that wasn't possible before. You might be able to connect the islands in your region and have regular meetings or a network of people who communicate today much more easily than before, because so many of us have been forced to get used to using Zoom. But I've actually been using Zoom to run this virtual organization with representatives in 20 different countries for more than 5 years. And this is Mihalia Strebner. We call her Midge because nobody can pronounce her name. And the fact that from the beginning of the organization, even though she was in Argentina and I was in Los Angeles, we could talk to each other and see each other 5 years ago, 6 years ago when we first started, and see other members of our team. Well, okay, most of the time I can see their faces. I don't know if any of you have ever been on a Zoom call and somebody kind of shrinks down on their phone, but we're all learning to use Zoom better. And this presentation is really what I've learned from people like this. This is the top of the head of one of the people who has most inspired me to create Sembra Media. Her name is Luz Meli Reyes, and she comes from Venezuela, although today she can't live there anymore because it wouldn't be safe for her. She'd almost certainly be arrested if she returned to her country, because simply trying to do honest journalism in the country that she's from is not acceptable today in her country. But in order for her to build a news organization, she had to ask for support from a lot of people. Venezuela has one of the most challenged economies in the world. They have hyperinflation. To give you a perspective, this is a real picture of somebody literally taking a wheelbarrow of money somewhere to use the Venezuelan currency. And it's devaluated so much that even wheelbarrows full of money aren't worth much anymore. This is a cartoon that kind of puts in perspective. The thief is robbing this poor little old lady who's obviously carrying a whole kind of cart with money on it, right? That's all piled up money on her little cart. And when she gets robbed, she says, okay, you can take the money, but please don't take my cart, because clearly that's worth so much more. And when journalists are working in environments that are that challenging, it's very hard to build a business model. So I want to start by acknowledging that I'm going to show you some ways that I've seen people raise money and make money as media organizations, but in some markets like Venezuela, when the economy is in such a difficult place, it's very hard to have any kind of traditional business model. And you pretty much have to rely on donations from people who want to support your work. And so Efecto Cuyo, which is the name of the news site that Luz Meli Reyes created. And Luz Meli Reyes and her partner created the site together. They were both working at a big daily newspaper. But as that country transformed and the government became more and more authoritarian, and the economy became worse and worse, and more people left the country, they decided to leave the media that they were working with, the newspaper they were working with, because they didn't feel that that newspaper was allowed to do the kind of journalism that they wanted to do. And so they left and created their own news site. And in order to do that in a country with such limited resources, they did a crowdfunding campaign. And they created a video, and they sent this video out to the world, and they said, please help us build this media organization that our country needs so much. And it's very hard in my experience for journalists to tell their own story well. I often joke that as journalists, we're trained to tell everyone else's story, but when it comes to promoting ourselves or explaining what we do, we're often not very good at it. And I think the two women that started this media organization in Venezuela under such difficult circumstance have an example to show anybody in any country, even if things are easier where you work. This message that they created really tells their story well. And so I'm going to pause for a second and play just a short video. It's in Spanish, but it has subtitles in English, so you should all be able to follow along. I'm going to start it now, unless there's a problem. Let me know if you have trouble hearing.
En los últimos años, los venezolanos hemos experimentado golpes de Estado, crisis económica y un grave aumento en la inseguridad física y jurídica.
Los medios de comunicación no escapan de esta realidad.
Hoy los periodistas venezolanos nos enfrentamos a la censura, a la falta de transparencia y a la dificultad de acceso a la información.
Además, la compra de medios masivos por parte de capitales afines al gobierno han reducido aún más el espacio para el ejercicio del periodismo libre.
Los pocos medios independientes que sobreviven se quedan solos y aislados, debilitados hasta el punto de su desaparición.
Cada vez es más difícil que se escuchen las voces disidentes.
Esto debilita el ejercicio de los derechos ciudadanos.
Hemos vivido ofensas, agresiones y amenazas por parte de altos funcionarios.
El sentido común nos dice, guarda silencio, calladita te ves más bonita. Somos periodistas de raza, somos periodistas de calle.
Y esta es nuestra vocación irrenunciable. Les presentamos Efecto Cuyo,
un medio de periodistas hecho por periodistas.
Un canal de información que profundiza e investiga, que además no depende de ningún factor de poder que condicione su línea editorial.
Ofrecemos contenido con un enfoque comprensivo que te ayude a saber dónde estamos parados.
Desde la información ayudamos a tener una sociedad más democrática.
Con tu respaldo vamos a profundizar en temas que pocos pueden contarte. Queremos hacer periodismo que ilumine.
Queremos ser el medio que insurge en defensa de tu derecho a estar bien informado.
Esto es un proyecto de vida. Cuando algunos nos sugieren rendirnos, nosotros decidimos dar la cara. Da el paso. El periodismo independiente necesita tu ayuda. Cada aporte cuenta. Desde ya te damos las gracias. Efecto Cucuyo.
Thank you for listening to that with me. In my experience, when I've shared that with other groups of students, teachers, journalists, many people relate to their story, even if they don't have the same experience, even if, like, I live in the US where journalism is not as challenging in many ways as it is in Venezuela, I can still relate to that story. Was anybody else moved by that story? Anybody else? You can raise your hand physically or put a little hand up and just let me know if that message came through. And I think, again, transcending the circumstance of how they created that. Thank you for those of you that are putting your hands up. That's awesome. I think this message from Luz Melly here saying, when a person gives you even $1 as a donation, that person becomes a partner, not just a reader. And that's why one of the trends that we've seen around the world, even in markets like the US, is turning more toward reader support, getting donations, getting subscriptions, starting membership programs that can help us build our media organizations, funded at least in part by the people who read them. But what really works about that video is that it kind of works like a 3-act play. So if you think about how they tell their story, they don't start by saying, everything's horrible in Venezuela, and if you don't give us money, we're gonna die. And I've seen journalists do that. The sky is falling, our world's falling apart, help, help, we're running out of money, please give us money, we need money or we're gonna die as journalists. And that message, especially if you tell it like you're really dying, may leave me feeling bad for you and wanting to help you, but it's probably going to leave me feeling like maybe I can't help you. That's too much for me to be able to help. But the message that Luz Melly and Laura do in the video that we just watched, that short video where they tell the story of their media, they don't cry for help. They tell you why their media is important, what's going on in the country, that means that people need information more than ever. And then they tell you why they're the ones to do it. We're journalists from the street. We're here to work hard to tell your stories. We're ready for this challenge. We're not screaming for help. We're not victims. We're here as champions. And then finally, in that third part that so many of us have trouble with, asking for help. And they don't just say, please help us. They say, every piece of support helps. With your support, we can do this together. And if you think about the difference of that message between just crying for help and showing why you're somebody who can make a difference and you're looking for others to invest in this better future, you're not asking for handouts, you're not begging for money, you're showing them that you're willing to do something if they can help. And that message, that kind of 3-step process that I've tried to outline here, describe the problem you want to solve, show that your team and you and your leadership have the skills to make it possible, and then explain what needs to happen to make it possible, your donation, your support, your sponsorship, your grant, whatever you're asking somebody to give you, that 3-part messaging, the problem I solve, the people I help, why I can do it, my team's right, and what we need to make it possible, is a perfect formula for almost any request for support. Questions, comments? If not, I can move on. There's a chat window you can open up and you can put questions in chat if you prefer. At the very end, I'll leave a little bit of time for questions, but I'll stop a couple times along the way and let you interact as well. So feel free to type questions in the chat or to ask me questions if you need to, now or in the future. For now, let me just continue. The other thing that Luz Melly and her partner do really well when they recognize that every dollar counts and that when somebody gives you money, they're giving you support, is to thank them, and thank them in very creative ways. So they had all the people who gave them support take pictures of themselves with signs, and then they published all of their pictures on the site to show what their supporters look like and to thank them for their recognition. Supporters are key, and they can be members, they can be readers, and they can also be other organizations. One of the other things I've learned from studying entrepreneurs and looking at what works is allies can really increase impact. So let me give you an example of an alliance with another media organization that's part of the world that I work in. It's a website called Periodismo de Barrio, news from the town. And it was started by a lovely young woman, Elaine Diaz, from Havana, Cuba. She was the first woman journalist from Cuba to win a Nieman Fellowship and study at Harvard. And using what she learned there, she came back and started an environmental news website, even before Wi-Fi was very strong in Cuba. And just to give you an idea, when she first started that website, the only place you could connect to the internet in most of Cuba was in public parks. You can notice there's a little tree outside her window there as she's laying across her own desk, waiting to see if there's enough internet in the public park that she's overlooking that she might be able to connect. And that kind of persistence, that kind of dedication to starting a website, even when you barely have enough bandwidth yourself to connect, is what led her to now, years later, have quite a bit of success with Periodismo de Barrio. She covers environmental issues, science issues. When COVID happened, she covered a lot of issues around the coronavirus. They do a lot of health stories as well. And very early in the pandemic, when things started to lock down, she realized that it was very dangerous for the journalists she works with to be out on the street in Cuba reporting on this. And so she partnered with another Cuban media site that's part of our network called El Toque. They both cover news in Cuba, but they do it differently. They have slightly different perspectives, and they cover different areas. And one of them, El Toque, is a little more focused on multimedia, Periodismo de Barrio, did more illustration. They both have writers and editors, but combining forces, working together, these two media leaders realized that their teams could complement each other, that they could do the stories slightly different on each of their sites, and that working together, they could do more stories with fewer journalists on the street for both of their media organizations and serve both of their audiences even better. And in doing that, they not only did better coverage, they really impressed one of the organizations that's given them grant funding in the past. And they sent a note to the organization and they said, hey, you gave us a grant to do this kind of story about the environment, but now that the pandemic's happened, we really think we need to cover this instead. Is it okay to change that? And oh, by the way, we're working in partnership now. And the foundation came back and said, wow, that's so impressive. We'd actually like to give you more money because we know that you're working even harder and having even more impact. So that story and some others that happened at the beginning of the pandemic, you can read on a website called ICFJ, which is actually one of the partners of my organization, Sembra Media. So when we write blog posts that we think have a broader interest, like here, we looked at several strategies, including another organization in Argentina, where when the team first started working in the virtual world instead of going to the office every day, they took this picture of themselves on Zoom and published it for their audience to see how they were working. So partnerships and being clearer with your audience and treating your audience as allies are really key to building modern digital news organizations. And so you can go to ICFJ and see stories like this about entrepreneurs all over the world. You can also sign up for their newsletter, which I highly recommend. They publish it in 7 or 8 different languages, including English, of course. And they also publish opportunities and deadlines. So if Google is doing a new big grant for innovation grants, or a foundation has some big challenge out there, or somebody's giving grants for environmental reporting, you'll find them promoted here with the information. And if you sign up for their newsletter, every week you'll get an update on what are the latest opportunities. There are a number of organizations today that are offering money to journalists to help improve the quality of journalism around the world, especially in areas like the environment, which I know is very important to you in your part of the world. Sombra Media has benefited from a lot of allies over the years. We have a lot of key partnerships. We've seen journalists partner together, and we partner with other organizations that support journalists and help journalists, that provide technical support and legal support and other things that our members need. And so as I end this section on how I've learned that allies are so important, I want to challenge you and take a moment here to take your questions and maybe even your examples or your best ideas. Who are your best allies? What can you offer a partner, and what would you need from them in return? And ideally, what can you create together? So at Sembra Media, we created a conference last summer, 2 summers ago, sorry, before the pandemic. We had a conference and we partnered with the Gabriel Garcia Marquez Foundation, which is a big journalism organization, has been around for many years in Latin America, but they didn't have as many members or as much expertise as we do with these new digital native media. So we partnered together to do a conference that was bigger than we could have done alone and brought in expertise that they didn't have for themselves. So I'd love to know if anybody on this call has a question about partnerships, an example they want to share, an example they've seen somebody else do, or an idea, or a question about anything else we've covered. I'll just pause for a second and welcome your participation. So you don't even have to necessarily share it with anyone else, but I would encourage you to be thinking about who would be a good partner. And even if you're not a media entrepreneur like the ones I'm talking about, just in your journalism career, or if you're a student, or if you're a professor, I find in almost every profession I've ever worked, people don't think as much about working together as they could, and they often miss opportunities as a result. So is there another professor that's studying something similar to you? Is there another journalist that's covering the same kinds of stories? And maybe you could work together to create a bigger story together. Those kinds of partnerships, even if you're not 2 media organizations, just 2 journalists, can make a huge difference.
So Janine, I'm gonna out some people here, and maybe they can talk a little bit more about it. But the USP Journalism Program has a partnership with this Fiji Sun newspaper, and so they, providing a sponsorship for prizes, providing opportunities for, like internships. But I don't know as much about it. So maybe if the Fiji Sun or USP want to chime in about this partnership that I know happens.
That's a fantastic example. I'd love to hear more.
Hi, thanks, Rebecca. It's Geraldine from the USP Journalism Program. And I believe some of our Fiji Sun colleagues are here as well. So, USP has a student training newspaper called Wansawara. So it's been around for a couple of years. And so what we do is we work in partnership with the Fiji Sun, who prints our newspaper free. And they circulate it, nationwide, countrywide, as part of that partnership. And, alongside our other media partners, they've also taken on some of our graduates as part of the professional attachment. So our other media colleagues have also jumped on board to provide that kind of exposure also for our students. So yeah, those are just some of the ways that we actually work with our media partners, not just in mainstream, but also our partners in CSOs, NGOs as well. Maybe, I'm not sure, maybe our colleagues from Fiji Sun or our other media partners would like to comment too on that.
It's a wonderful example. Does somebody else want to offer more? Hi.
Hello.
Yeah.
Good morning. Yeah, I just know one of my colleagues who's working with me is Adi Lisa. So she has been doing some kind of stories along. She's working with Rossi, our digital manager. So they working with the grant that has been provided to them. So they have been working and getting a lot of stories out. My friend has shared, yeah, we working with USP also, and we also taking the graduates also, and also doing attachment and all. So it's a pretty good experience too. We get funds, and then we are able to go far distant areas to cover stories, which is a very big help for us during this time. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Well, those are wonderful. Great. Well, with your permission, I'll continue with the presentation, but again, feel free to jump in, interrupt, or offer suggestions, ideas, or questions at any time. So the other thing that we've learned over and over from studying these media is that diversified revenue is the key to sustainability and independence. And I'm going to talk more about that, but first I want to qualify that not all of the media organizations we've studied are profitable. They're not all making lots of money. In fact, I don't know any journalist who started a media organization because they wanted to make a lot of money. Most of them started it because they wanted to make a difference, and then they hope to at least be sustainable or maybe a little bit profitable. But most of them start with what we call viability. If you just can survive, which means maybe the original founders are volunteers, maybe you're just paying a little bit for the technical support of the organization. Eventually you get to sustainability where you can actually pay your staff and have a media organization that can last for a long time. And if you're fortunate and smart and things go well, you can get to profitable. Well, we've also learned that there are kind of two different paths to this. One of them is big audiences. So if you reach millions of people because you're a big regional, national organization, then you have a better chance at profitability because you can monetize through advertising, big donor campaigns, subscriptions, things like that, that really take large audiences. If you have a small audience, but you cover a really good niche, then you may also be able to at least be sustainable, if not profitable. So if you cover business or technology or legal issues, you might hit an audience that has the money to pay for your content. Or if you cover environmental issues or women's issues or other things that people want to donate money to support, you might get grant funding for even with a relatively small niche. And if you have the right people in your audience, you may get sponsors because they want to reach that exclusive audience, even if it's not a big audience. So there are a lot of different ways to monetize these, and we found a lot of different sources of revenue. So even within advertising, there are different kinds of advertising. There's simple Google ads that you can just copy and paste some code on your website and they automatically appear. But unless you have millions and millions of page views, you're not going to make very much money with that. You might make $50 a month or a couple $100 a month if you have a reasonable audience, 50,000 people maybe. But if you get to having millions of people, then there are other kinds of advertising that can be more lucrative, like programmatic advertising and other kinds of sponsorships. And that's something you can study as you get bigger, but just know if you're small starting out, what we found is a lot of times it's easier to monetize with crowdfunding campaigns or donor programs, grants, or start organizing events or offering some kind of consulting or training services where you can monetize your skills while you're building up the audience in your media organization. Feel free to take a picture of this or to take notes as I go. I'll show this screen again before we finish, but I'm not telling you should try and do all of these. I'm saying you should find the right mix. So here's an example of a media organization that found the right mix. They're based in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and Checkiado is the first fact-checking site in all of Latin America. Today, there are dozens of them. But it was the first website where a group of journalists and others got together and said, we want to fact check what the politicians say. We want to fact check what health advice is out there and what other recommendations there are. And so they assembled a team of really smart journalists and experts in law, politics, consumer issues, fraud, other things where there are common misinformation in the marketplace. And they started just checking, is this really true? Is that really true? And that information quickly got an audience. They have a couple million visitors every month who are interested in what they have to say. But the way that they support themselves is through a complex mix of donations from the audience, support from corporations, sponsorships of events and other things they do, what they call international cooperation, which is really things like grant funding from European foundations, from US foundations and others. They also do events that they organize themselves, trainings and things like that. So they get money from a number of different sources. And on their own website, they explain where that money comes from. Because they believe if they're going to be the ones fact checking what other people say, they have to be extremely transparent about where their money comes from and that they are a neutral group trying to study this. They don't have a political case to make. They're just trying to separate truth from not truth. And they really believe, and I think they say it really well, I've translated here the message on their website, to guarantee our sustainability and independence. We have a funding strategy which includes a balanced and diverse set of revenue sources. And what they're saying there is because we don't depend on any one source of revenue, nobody can tell us what we can and can't print. So they have taken money, and sometimes they've been criticized. They've taken money from the National Endowment for Democracy, which is funding from the US government. They've taken funding from European foundations that get money from European governments. And people in Argentina say, well, how can you say you're neutral if you're taking money from foreign governments? And the answer that they give is, we take money from lots of different places, so we never have to take money from our own government. Because the government of Argentina, like many others in the world, Mexico is another classic example, spend a lot of money on advertising. And because they put so much advertising into traditional media, they actually have quite a bit of influence about what gets published. And so when Checkiado started and was founded, they decided from the start that they would never take any money from the local government, so that there would never be any question about whether they were correcting what the government had to say, as well as other leaders in the community. But in order to do that, they had to find support from other places. And I think that's really sums up a lot of what we've learned. The more different sources of revenue you have, the less any one of them can influence or control what you do. And then the other thing I like about Checkiado is, again, very transparent. They have this is a policy for corrections and updates. So if they get something wrong, and you know what, we're all human, we all make mistakes. They check facts. They're out there working really hard to double check facts. And every once in a while, not very often, but every once in a while, they get one wrong or it's not quite the full story. And they always correct it. And they always do it the same way. And they're always really clear and honest. And so fact-checking sites have to be especially careful about having diversified revenue and a lot of transparency and a lot of independence, or how would I trust that you're the one who's telling me the facts? But this is a network of some of the fact-checking sites in the world, and it's growing as we speak. More and more of them are appearing all over the world. One of the first ones I ever found is actually in Ukraine, and it's called Stop Fake. And it was very clearly created because there was a lot of Russian propaganda in the country of Ukraine. If you know much about that part of the world, you know there is a history of conflict and disputes over ownerships of boundaries and things like that. And information wars is one of the ways that a lot of governments fight. So Stop Fake was started by journalists and journalism professors trying to find a way to fight back against fake information that was being shared around their country. And again, they're very transparent and very open about who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. In Mexico, we've seen more and more of these. This is a little tiny one. Started in Monterrey, Mexico by two women journalists who were so frustrated. One of them told me there were lots of stories that the newspapers she worked for wouldn't let her write. But one of them, she wanted to do a story on how Coca-Cola is bad for your health because it has so much sugar in it. And they wouldn't let her write it because they get advertising from Coca-Cola. And she said, that's it, I'm done. And she started her own website. And this site, again, is a fact-checking and local news site. So they cover local news in their area, but they also really look for things that are misinformation in the region. You should know some of the countries we work in have economic challenges. Some of them people face the chance of being arrested for some of the work they do. In Mexico, it's one of the most dangerous places in the world. And a lot of the journalists we work with risk getting kidnapped, killed, or worse. This is actually a cartoon that was developed by a journalist who was kidnapped and held for a couple of weeks, beaten very badly, and finally released and just left on the side of the road. And he said he really didn't know how he survived. He had written a series of stories about young men who had disappeared in a city known for drug trafficking. And it was pretty clear that it was the narco drug traffickers in the area that were kidnapping people. And in the end, it seems they kidnapped him for writing stories about them. And in the end, he actually had to leave that city, as many journalists do, because his life was threatened again and he felt that he had to leave. It's really one of the hardest parts about what we do is that some of the journalists we work with risk not just their livelihoods, but their very lives to do what we do. And it's part of what inspires me. And when we talk about financial sustainability, we're also talking about financial security, because it's a lot easier to have bodyguards and reinforced doors and take a cab instead of a bus because it's safer if you have the financial resources to do that. And those things can make a real difference for the people we work with. And after I talk about something that heavy, I always try to take a moment, take a breath, and give us all kind of a chance to remember that, that there are kittens in the world too. And that one of the other things I've seen a lot of journalists do is they get so focused, I'm going to tell the world about this terrible thing, that they forget that your readers need a break once in a while too. And that it's okay to cover a variety of news because it helps us have a break. And obviously the investigative journalism, the hard news, the stories that help us know how to live our lives better are vital and important. And what to do in the coronavirus is vital, and how to understand climate change and save the environment is vital. And all those stories need to be covered as well as they can. But it's okay to have kittens and puppies and other things too, once in a while, to balance what we share. And I use that a little bit as a joke. Your version might not be actual kittens. It might be something else. But I'll show you some examples of media that do more than just hard news to help you understand. So I don't know how many of you actually already have a media organization. I didn't say this earlier, but if you work for a news organization or you run one or you have a blog or a Facebook page you want us to know about, feel free to put it up in chat. Hey, check out this and put the URL. You're welcome to share your own news organizations while I talk. But a lot of the people I talk to haven't started one yet. Most journalists I've met have at least thought about maybe creating their own podcast or newsletter or blog or whole media organization. Most of us have at least thought about it, even if we haven't done it. But then you ask, how much does it cost? How much money do I need to do this, right? It's not a simple question. So we have actually been studying, and I do kind of have an answer to that. But before I tell you how much it might cost to create a news organization, let me just check, is it okay being shared now? Please discard earlier question. Oh, okay. I was just noticing a question coming in.
You just asked the question earlier about this exact question, and so you're going to answer it now. So she's just saying, disregard my earlier question.
Well, then I'm so glad I'm going to answer one of your questions. Well, before I answer your question, which I will, I'm going to tell you a story about somebody who started something that wasn't a news organization, because I think it might give you an idea about entrepreneurship in general. So this is a story about a man I met in Los Angeles about 15 years ago. And he is a phenomenal chef and a very creative chef. He figured out how to combine Korean food with Mexican food. That was his idea creativa. Sorry, the slide's still in Spanish. His creative idea was to mix Mexican and Korean flavors because they're both very spicy. And he created this really exotic food that a lot of people loved. But he didn't have enough money to start a whole restaurant, right? I'm guessing a lot of journalists, I know a lot of the journalists I work with don't have the money to start a whole big news organization with 50 reporters and everything else you might want. So he went out and just bought a truck. And he bought a little truck more than 10 years ago and started selling gourmet tacos. It was called the Kogi truck, and he is a gourmet chef. And you have to understand, before the Kogi truck, most of the trucks in Los Angeles that sold food were little taco trucks, and the food was known to be very bad. And they mostly stopped in places where there were workers working really hard that had to buy a cheap lunch in the day and didn't have time to even go somewhere. So the truck would drive around and people would buy tacos out of the truck. But all of a sudden, Kogi came along and it was gourmet food. And not only did he have a truck with gourmet food, he was the first person I know of to add a Twitter feed to his truck route. So he started collecting the addresses from his really smart, often well-heeled fans of his food and started putting up, we'll be at the corner of 4th and Main Street at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and we'll be on this corner at 1 o'clock this afternoon. And people started lining up before the truck even got there. So you could be walking through Los Angeles and see a line of like 50 people standing lined up to the corner, and there was nothing there. And you'd say, what are you waiting for? And they'd say, the Kogi truck, we're gonna have Kogi tacos. It became like this cool thing to do in LA. But let me tell you, it became such a cool thing to do in LA, and this won't surprise you if you've been to most major cities now, that there are lots and lots of gourmet trucks in the world today. But I want you to understand that the very first one was the Kogi truck, and nobody thought it was a good idea when he first started. They thought he was going to be a terrible failure because people only sold cheap food out of trucks, not gourmet food. But today, in Los Angeles, in New York, in Paris, all over the world, there are gourmet food trucks. And they really were inspired first and foremost by the Kogi truck. Now, don't worry about my friend the chef. Today he has multiple restaurants, multiple trucks. He's very successful. And to make a point of really recognizing how revolutionary his idea was, in the airport in Los Angeles is one of his trucks as an example and a model and a historic recognition of this transformation of gourmet food in trucks. So you could say that he changed the way that the restaurant industry worked, mostly because he couldn't afford to start a restaurant So he just did a little truck first. But he did it different because he added Twitter and he added gourmet food. And you can do it different too. So, okay, how much does it cost? Well, he had to rent license the truck. I don't know how much his budget was. But when we interview media founders who start media organizations, we found that most of them, the vast majority of them, started with less than $10,000 in initial investment. But a lot of them go on to actually make more than $500,000 in revenue over time as they grow. So it doesn't take much to start them. In fact, a lot of them start with volunteers. They spend a little bit of money on web hosting. Maybe a couple $100 is the total initial investment for many. In fact, the very first one we ever found, El Faro, was started in Venezuela in El Salvador in 1998. It's the oldest one we know of. It's more than 20 years old. Digital native media. There was barely internet connection in 1998 in El Salvador, but they started online, get this, because they couldn't afford newspaper. The cost of printing the paper was really expensive. So in 1998, they started a website called El Faro. And today, throughout Latin America, most people who work in the world that I work with digital media know that they're one of the first ones that ever started. And they really became a model for others, kind of like the Kogi truck became a model for many others. So in your part of the world, you should be looking around. Who are the innovators? Who are the first ones to have a podcast that really gets attention? Who are the ones that have a website that's actually having impact? And use them as models as others develop. That's a lot of what we do at Sembra Media. The other thing about how much does it cost to start and how do you start is this concept that a lot of people who work with entrepreneurs talk about, the minimal viable product. What do we mean by minimal viable product? Well, it's what's the smallest version of your big idea that you can actually get done and put up on the internet and see how people respond. So if you had $100,000 to start a website, I wouldn't recommend that you spend that $100,000, build the website and then launch it. I'd recommend that you spend $5,000 or $10,000, get a basic little website started, and then save the rest of it to support yourselves while you run it over time, and maybe invest another $20,000 6 months later when you know, hey, this section of the site seems to be getting a lot of attention, but this section not so much attention, so we'll invest more here. That minimal viable product is what you need to test the idea. And I think this slide really helps you understand even more what a minimal viable product is. It's not, if you look at this where it says not like this, it's not developing a car and saying, well, the minimal viable product of a car is a tire. Well, no, that tire is really kind of useless by itself, right? It doesn't really represent a car. What a car really is something that moves and helps you move. But if you consider minimal viable product a skateboard, okay, I could get on a skateboard and I could move a little faster than I can walk. And then maybe you could put a handle on it and I could have more control. You could turn it into a bicycle and I could go even faster, then a motorcycle, then a car. That's how you develop. So there's actually something usable at each stage, not like just a tire, but a skateboard. So when you think about what's the minimal viable product, think about this metaphor and then test your idea. And maybe you'll end up with a fleet of motorcycles, or maybe you'll end up with electric cars. You never know. But testing it little by little in a way that actually works. So applying that to media, I could give you another example from Mexico. Animal Politico is a very big, many millions of people visit this site every year. It covers politics and news throughout the country. But it started as a Twitter page. All they had was Twitter. They spent no money to do Twitter. They just started putting headlines up on Twitter to see what people responded to, what kinds of stories they seemed interested in, what area they should focus on. And then once they'd gotten better at that, then they added the whole website and they took it to another level. And today they're a very well-respected source of news for the whole country of Mexico, and they compete on a regular basis as one of the top sites in the country. But they started with almost no investment on Twitter. And then once they figured out their audience and their messaging, went to having a website that costs more to run. Then they realized that not everybody wants to advertise on a website that's very political and can sometimes be controversial. So they also created a website called Animal Gourmet. And Animal Gourmet, as the name implies, is all about food and restaurants and things that taste good. And lots of people want to advertise on that site because they want to advertise their restaurants and get people to come. But they use the money they make on that website to do serious news projects like Narcodata, where they actually used database-driven information to study how drug trafficking works around the country, where some areas might be safer or more dangerous and why. those kinds of stories that take a lot of money and a lot of time and resources to go find all the data and develop can be funded by projects that aren't necessarily directly related, like Animal Gourmet supporting narco data. So then we ask the question, like, should you share different types of information in different ways? Is it okay for one organization to do this? And I think it works pretty well for Animal Politico. Here's another example. In Bolivia, there's a website that I've admired for a number of years called La Región. And they're, again, an environmental news site. A lot of the websites in our directory, I think a significant, at least 15 or 20% of the media organizations of the 800 plus that we work with cover the environment. A lot of journalists who start their own news organizations are specifically interested in this and feeling like most of the traditional media they worked for don't cover the environment as well as they think they should. Again, I know this is a big story in your area. I'm sure everybody covers it, but I am sure there are also elements of those stories that some of you might realize are not being covered as well as they could. That was the motivation for my friend Dolly Layton when she started La Región. And if you notice, she supports her organization mostly through advertising. They also do some services and consulting. But this little banner at the top says, buy advertising from us. And then it's actually an animation that says, we reach thousands of people. So she's advertising her own advertising. And she's got a page about how you can advertise with her to make it easy. But here's something that came up for her that I thought was fascinating in how she dealt with it. On this website, she really tries to focus on real news, serious stories, environmental reporting. And if you want to advertise, she wants to put it in a banner or in a box or something that clearly marks that this is an ad and this is news stories. But she started getting all these press releases from travel agents and people who just wanted to promote tourism. And they didn't want to buy an ad. They wanted her to publish a story and they wanted her to publish photos. And at first she said, well, I can't do that because journalists don't publish things. Most journalists that I work with would not publish a story in a good media organization just because somebody paid for it. You'd put ads next to it. You'd tell your readers that the ads are paid for, but the stories should not be paid for. That's how most of us grew up in what we believe. And she believed that. And I think she's right to defend the integrity of the news that she creates on the site. But she said it was really hard because she kept saying no to people who wanted to give her money and she needed the money. So finally she did something kind of different. She created a second website called Soy Bolivia, I'm Bolivia. And she runs both these websites. The only thing she puts on Soy Bolivia are press releases and photos for public relations companies. But it actually is a beautiful site. A lot of that publicity stuff is actually very nice and very useful for tourists. But putting it on a second website and separating it from her other material helped her to keep her sense of integrity and the independence and transparency she wanted on her news site and still benefit from the fact that she had an audience interested in travel and ecotourism and she could put those PR pieces there. So I think that sometimes you have to think about, in order to support the thing that I really want to serve the community in terms of information they need, maybe there's another kind of information like travel information or food information that might help me make the money I need to serve that community. And if you really think about it, that's how a lot of big newspapers have worked forever. They had a news section, but they also had a food section. They also had a travel section. And even though she's a digital native media born on the internet, she also has a magazine. But she only publishes the magazine 4 times a year. So she doesn't spend as much on print, but she does have a physical product to give people once in a while. I'm going to pause here just for a second again. Anything in chat I should know about? How we're doing? I think we have about 5 minutes left of our time.
Nothing in, no new questions in chat. So
fabulous. Then I'll just keep going. Another thing that I think is really important to think about when you're in creating a new idea. First, you should look around and see what everybody else is doing. What are the other media? If everybody else is covering the environment really well, maybe you should cover something totally different, or you should do it in a very different way. So we start to ask, what makes you special? What's your unique value proposition? What's the value that you bring to the marketplace that's different from the other media there? One of the ones in Latin America that's really fascinating me as a standout different idea is called El Surti. They're actually based in Paraguay, which is a relatively small country. And they do what's called visual storytelling. And they do visual storytelling on many different topics. And they even created a school where they teach other people how to do visual storytelling. So they now make money from courses, training, and services. They offer visual, this kind of wonderful graphic stuff to corporations, to foundations, to other organizations. And they offer classes and lectures on how others can do it. And they make money from all of those different services, training, and events that they can use to illustrate the stories they want. And so often they're working with other media to help illustrate a story. So maybe there are already lots of people covering the news well in your community, but nobody's illustrating it, which tends to attract younger readers, can help people who have limited literacy or maybe speak a different language primarily. Visual storytelling can be a great way to make things more accessible to people. And again, if I come back to this, there are lots of different ways to earn money. And one of them is to take your expertise, like visual storytelling, and charge a premium, a very high rate because you're a professional, to corporations and others, so that you can afford to have time to do it for free or for very little for media organizations or for your own website. And a lot of organizations are doing that. These other sources of revenue, events, consulting, training, products that support their work. One of the easiest things to start is just doing some kind of consulting services. So what can you do that people will pay so much money for, it can help you afford to have the time to do the journalism you want. This is an example from Ecuador. And they're a local news site in Ecuador that has covered some very important stories. Environmental issues, yes, of course, like so many. But they've also covered investigative news around the Catholic Church, around politics, many of the issues in their community. Again, started by 2 journalists. We see this a lot. A couple of journalists get together and start these organizations. And they realized early on, one of their advertising clients came and said, I love the way you write on your site. Could you write copy for my website? And they realized that they could do a whole business as an agency, and that using their skills as journalists, as videographers, as illustrators, and everything else that they do, they could provide a wide range of services. And today, a significant part of their revenue comes from an agency where they do creative production for a wide range of clients and brands in their community. And that material is published on their websites. And I'll leave you with just one more, and then I'll stop for any last questions. There's another model I've seen that's kind of cool, and this works whether you start your own media organization or you're working in a bigger one, or you're just trying to think about how to help the world have more valuable information. Increasingly, I'm seeing journalists drawn to work with scientists and academics to try and help them tell their stories better. So this is an example of Ciencia del Sur, Science of the South. And they realized that scientists in their part of the world were not getting the attention they deserve. But part of it is because scientists are not very good at explaining what they do in ways that average people understand. So they started covering science stories and trying to make them more accessible to average people, but they do it with a whole team. They have a whole group of scientists, more than 27 scientists that they've worked with. And so they do what I call journalistic interpretation. These 2 journalists help the scientists explain their research, their theories, their studies, their science, so that more average people who haven't studied science and have a PhD in it can understand what they're talking about. So I'll leave you with this message. Think about who are your best allies as you work toward building your own organization and building your own career. Even if you're not thinking about starting a new media organization, partnerships and allies and building a network is what's most improved my career, and it's one of the things that's most helped every entrepreneur, consultant, and freelance journalist I know in the world, as well as everybody who's used their network to build their career. And if you're not already focused on the internet, consider this. Very soon, most of the world is going to be connected in a very high-speed way, even on islands, even in remote parts of the world. Through satellite technology and others, we will have broadband all around the world. And now you might be wondering why I have a slide up there where it kind of looks like the map's upside down. Anybody else think I've got my map upside down here? Well, let me just end with you thinking about this. We live on a round planet, last I checked, right? With a few crazy people who think the world is flat. I think most of us believe the world is round. And okay, you could consider that the United States and Europe are on the top, and Africa and Asia and Australia and other parts of the world are on the bottom. But, you know, this is really arbitrary, right? If we're a globe just floating in space, Why is one way right side up and the other not? If I have a marble in my hand, there's not an upside down and a right side up. We're a round planet, right? So if you think about where maps came from and why maps of the world put Europe and the United States on top and Africa and Asia and Australia and the South Pacific on the bottom, you might want to look at who were the people who made the maps we use today. And I would suspect that most of the maps and most of the classrooms that I saw growing up were made by people who started in Europe. Because they were in that part of the world, they put it on top. But if you look at maps today, you should know that they not only put Europe on top, they distorted Europe to make it look bigger. Remember, the world's round, so when you try to flatten it out, you kind of have to distort it. The map that's on the screen right now is actually more accurate than most of the maps we saw in school. And I want you to notice that Africa is a lot bigger than Europe, that South America is a lot bigger than the United States. But on the maps that most of us are used to seeing, because of the distortion of making the top part look bigger and the bottom part look smaller to make it fit on a flat map, has given us a different view of the world. And I'm not going to say one is right or wrong, which one's right side up, which one's upside down. I'm just going to say that if you want to change the world, if you want to have an impact, one of the things I've seen across all the entrepreneurs that I've worked with is they're good at looking at things from a different angle. And they're good at questioning everything they see. And they don't just accept that like this is right side up and this is upside down. They say, why is it like that? Could it be a different way? Maybe I'm the one that's going to start the revolution of gourmet food trucks. Maybe I'm going to be the first digital native media in 1998 in Central America. Maybe you're going to create the first of something else. And that is really what I wanted to share with you today. That in my research studying entrepreneurs all over the world, I found that the ones that are most creative, that most question the things around them and are willing to try something new and experiment till they figure out how to make it work are the ones that have the greatest impact, and generally the ones that are really quite happy and satisfied with the work they do in the world. And I wish that for all of you, that you find the way to be most happy and satisfied in your work and the way to make a difference. I am inspired every day by journalists like Luce Millie Reyes and others who risk everything to share their stories and information they think is vital to their communities. But they also tell me that they love what they do. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Janine. We got a couple of comments in the chat saying, thank you for these great insights. It's given us much to think about. We need to start looking at things a different way. And so we can start thinking about how we can use our love of writing for something bigger. So you got a lot of kudos in the chat and the comments. Thank you so much for helping us, turn things on its head. I liked the snowman a lot. It was very cute. Lots of ways to look at things. And I really like the question of allies because it's something that I talk about with people who run NGOs a lot, is you need to come up with how are you going to be self-sufficient and sustainable? What is something that you can sell? I mean, you can sell classified ads, and certain websites become very famous for their classified ads that really support the great journalism they do. Or you see, and I really liked your examples of what people saw was popular, capitalize on that to support the work and support the journalists. So thank you so much for helping people think a little bit more broadly. And Joanna from Nauru said, thanks for the great presentation. It's very insightful. Kashmita said, thanks for the very informative session, for creating insights and examples. So clearly the audience had very many things to say thank you. So thank you very, very much. We look forward to sharing this video more broadly.
Great. Well, thank all of you for your time and attention. I wish you all a fabulous rest of your day. And I'm always here. If you want to send an email and follow up, please feel free.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for participating in session 4. In one more hour, we have our final session about solutions-based journalism. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.
I'm a big fan of that topic too. Great choice. Wishing you all the best. Ciao, ciao.